Okay, I'd like to welcome everyone here to the panel discussion on the future of the Republican Party. Since its nadir in following 1964 elections, the Republican Party has had a pretty good run of it. There have been a few setbacks, 1974, 1986. But for the most part, symposia on the future of political parties is something the Democratic Party has done. But I think we're seeing a little bit different discussion recently following the 2006 elections, and so I'm very pleased to have put together a panel that can discuss the various aspects of the Republican Party's past and its future as it goes forward. As far as format for today's discussion, I'll give each of our commentators a few minutes to make a few opening remarks, but we'll leave most of the time for sort of an open discussion about the issues that are raised. So the first panelist I'd like to introduce is Mickey Edwards, who is a lecturer in the school, but also serves as executive director of Aspen Institute's Rodel Fellowships in Public Leadership, which provides annual leadership skills training and in-depth issues involvement for political leaders from both U.S. political parties. He was a Republican member of Congress from Oklahoma for 16 years and a member of the House Republican leadership. And he's served on a number of panels and taught at a number of institutions since leaving the U.S. House. Is most recently the author of Reclaiming Conservatism, which hopefully he'll share some of those thoughts with us this afternoon. Our second panelist, also someone that I've had the pleasure of having teach for us at the school, Jim Leach, Princeton class of '64, who's the, and I would stress, interim director of Harvard University's Institute of Politics. We very much hope to have him return to Princeton as soon as possible. Prior to his current position, Leach was the John L. Weinberg Goldman Sachs and Company visiting professor of public and international affairs here at the Woodrow Wilson School. As you all are well aware, he's a former Republican congressman for Iowa, where he served 15 terms in the U.S. Congress from 1977 to 2007. He served as the chairman of the subcommittee on East Asian Public Affairs in the House Committee most recently, but was a longtime chair of the House Banking Committee. Considered a political moderate, he's been the chair of the Ripon Society and the Republican Mainstream Committee, two national Republican organizations that encourage bipartisan policymaking. And finally, we have joining us someone I haven't had the pleasure of having teach for us, but maybe that could change in the future. Juleanna Glover Weiss, who advises major corporate clients on a wide variety of issues from patent reform to Securities Exchange Commission issues and intellectual property. She has over 15 years of experience in government policy debates, high-profile political campaigns, and corporate controversies in the United States and abroad. She has served on the senior staffs of President-elect George W. Bush, Vice President Cheney, Mayor Rudy Giuliani, and various presidential candidates, including Steve Forbes and John Ashcroft. I'd also like to say that this event is co-sponsored with a student organization that I've had a nice connection with the last few years. That is the Woodrow Wilson Political Network, whose primary emphasis is on getting students from the Woodrow Wilson School engaged in electoral politics and enhancing their opportunities for careers therein. So let me stop with introductions and turn it over to Mickey for some opening remarks.
I've already told Nolan, since he's my dean, I'll do whatever he tells me to do. When you have a topic like the future, what is the future of the Republican Party? It's really two different questions. And one of those questions is, what is the likelihood of Republicans gaining and holding elective office? Gaining and holding control of the Congress? Gaining and holding control of the presidency, and that's something that's almost impossible to predict because the polls today and the polls tomorrow aren't going to tell you very much because it depends on what issues arise. You have some other kind of an attack on the United States that causes people to elevate the concerns about national security to the dominant issue in the country and allows Republicans to say, well, there was not another attack on the United States between 9/11 and today. Obviously, something's been done right, and the issue helps Republicans. Or you have the scandal focus that was on Abramoff and Bob Ney and Duke Cunningham now becomes on the Bill Jefferson and very. I don't want to mention names. I know what some of the investigations are that are ongoing. But to predict what the future is in terms of who's going to win the next election or the election after that is almost impossible. There's so many variables that enter into it, including any Republican candidate for the presidency is ultimately going to have the opportunity to run against a Democrat. And that so far has proved to be something that Republicans can count on and look forward to. So that can happen. But I want to change maybe what was the direction of the question. That's one way that you look at what's the future of the Republican Party. I think the bigger question is what's the future of the Republican Party in terms of what it is, what it stands for, what it believes. And that, I think, it raises a lot, in my view, it raises a lot of very, very troubling questions. Because the Republican Party, which is dominated by conservatives, and I am one. My friend Jim was the head of the Ripon Society. I was the national chairman of the American Conservative Union. And I was one of the three founders of the Heritage Foundation. And I'm aware of the fact that conservatives dominate the Republican Party, and I'm a conservative. But what conservatism is today is so far, far different from what it was. You talked about, the Goldwater years, Nolan. If you look at the way the Republican national platform has changed in the last 40 years, you find that the conservatives who were the first to come out in favor of giving the District of Columbia a vote in the U.S. House are now threatening to oppose it and the president to veto it should that come about. The Republicans who supported the Equal Rights Amendment and now later became the party that opposed the Equal Rights Amendment, the party that strongly resisted federal involvement in many issues outside the purview of the constitutional limitations, has turned into a party that seems to know almost no limits on what it thinks the federal government should be involved in. Whether it's overturning state referenda, as it did in Oregon, interfering in medical decisions and local judicial decisions, as it did with Terry Schiavo, or whatever. It has become a party that, as the American electorate is fairly conservative, actually, and it's almost like a dodgeball, where as the electorate moves closer and closer to where Republicans were, they move farther to the right. They keep, what can we do to move farther and farther away so that the electorate doesn't catch up with us? And it doesn't seem to me that that's the appropriate way to try to win elections. But not only that, I think it's a scary thing because you have to have a party that believes very strongly in the limitations imposed by the Constitution, that understands that during the Goldwater years, conservatives were just as bothered about what they saw happening in our social structure as perhaps they are now. Things they didn't see happening that they liked, whether it was abortion or whatever else. But it would not occur to them that it was their job to use the federal government, the power of the federal government, to impose their beliefs, because they thought that was not what conservatives believed. And so I just, for my opening comments, just want to say that the question shouldn't be just, are we going to win more elections? But if we do, is that good? What do we stand for? The final point I'll make, because Jim, who I like and admire very much, is here with me. We both served for a long time in Congress. I served 16 years. I thought that was a long time, and then Jim served twice as long. And we understood, I think both of us, what the responsibilities of the Congress were, and that the Congress was not only a separate branch of government and an independent branch of government, but that it was an equal branch of government. Very few people in Washington understand that today. Members of Congress today use the Freedom of Information Act to try to get information from the executive branch. When I testified before the House Judiciary Committee about presidential signing statements, very few, certainly on our side of the aisle, Jim, very few Republicans were at all bothered by the idea that a president of the United States would simply say, here's the bill, you passed it, I signed it, it's the law, it's binding on every janitor, every teacher, everybody else except me, because I'm the president. And very few members of Congress seem bothered by that, especially Republicans and conservatives. Seem totally unfazed by a president declaring that he was not bound by the laws he signs. So I just want to, I'll put it back to you, Nolan, and the others. I think that the future could be rosy in terms of Republicans getting elected. I'm no longer as sure as I was that that's good for the country.
Okay, thanks. Jim?
Mickey, referencing the party platform made me think, as everybody in politics has heard many times, one of the oldest jokes in politics, and I think it goes back to Bismarck, is that one shouldn't ever watch laws or sausages being made, but one should never, ever, ever read the Republican platform. In any regard, all parties at all times have tensions within them, and they're also always in transition. But I don't think there's been a more modern day point when a political party has as many fissures as the Republican Party does today. And to understand this, it's important to ask what a political party is. Is a political party its leaders? Is it the party organization, that is the county and the precinct and the state apparatus? Is it its heritage? Is it its core voters? Is it its active volunteers? And it's hard really to get a feel for what is a political party. And so let me touch on this for a second. From a leadership perspective, there used to be a division in the Republican Party between moderates and conservatives. And the division was symbolized by, on the conservative side, Robert Taft, Barry Goldwater, later Ronald Reagan. On the moderate side, the kind of the pragmatism of Eisenhower and maybe the urban concerns of Rockefeller. Those were the divisions. Today, those divisions don't exist in that way. That is, the so-called moderate aspect of national republicanism is absolutely without any weight whatsoever. And the divisions are between two kinds of conservatism: social conservatism and economic conservatism. And these are two very different value structures. The economic conservative is also generally an individual rights conservative. The social conservative is not only concerned with what you call the value agenda, but, and this is, I think, what Mickey's book is more than likely slightly about. It's one thing to have a set of values. And let's say one is pro-life. And that's a very credible thing to be. And it's a very different thing to say you want to socialize your values. That is, you want to impose your values on someone else. And that is the new direction of the Republican Party, which is, frankly, at a very different point than when Mickey entered politics for Barry Goldwater. And it's no accident that in today's politics, Goldwater, who was considered a little bit divisive in his era, would be at the left wing of the Republican Party today. And that's a very interesting phenomenon. In any regard, there are three of the contrasts in the Republican Party philosophically, and some of it, this is a little bit by emphasis. One is a contrast between a type that's for a tax cut at all costs versus someone else that puts more weight on fiscal discipline, that is a balanced budget. Those are two different attitudinal things. Another is a conflict between the individual rights conservative and those that believe more in socialized values. And then a third, which is a very interesting conflict that has never really existed in the way it does today, is between what might be called a non-interventionist in foreign policy and a military adventurist. Now those are, I pasted or described the last a little pejoratively, but between someone that might be more inclined to use military force. Years ago, we had a lot of talk about a Southern strategy, and it was first really a little bit talked about under the administration of Eisenhower. It was given some meaning under the administration of Richard Nixon, and then it really has come into fruition under the administration of Karl Rove. And the majority that Rove put together, in some ways, is extremely impressive. The idea of a fundamentalist Christian movement coupled with old-line republicanism is one way to reach a majority. And that's what we have today. The trouble is that the math that fit 2004 may not be a great math for the future, because if you think about it, there are a lot of new wave citizens that don't fit either description. There are a lot of young voters that aren't terribly impressed with the Republican sets of policies. And then there are fissures within old-line republicanism that aren't trivial. And so the party has kind of moved from being the country club party in leadership to being the church basement in leadership. And that means, among other things, that some of the country club leave. And as you open the door, which the Republicans in one sense very impressively have to socioeconomic groups that weren't traditionally Republican, and that's partly what the fundamentalist groups are, socioeconomically not innately Republican. It's also causing, as you open the door to some, it's causing others to walk out. I used to joke to my wife in my first campaign for Congress, and Mickey and I came in together. That was my second campaign, because unlike Mickey, I'd been thumped.
Me too. That was my second. Yeah.
But in my first campaign, I used to joke to my wife that the only base Republican vote that I could find were Episcopal ministers and wives of doctors. Today, there is not an Episcopal minister in America that's Republican, and very, very few doctors' wives. I mean, things shift. I mean, the lawyer, doctor, banker is moving away from the Republican Party in ways that would be surprising. And by the way, the real rich are moving away from republicanism. And so oddly, some of the platforms that were for it, and I have very seldom been more outraged by any economic precept than the idea that we want to bring an end to the, quote, death tax. That's Republican vocabulary. I think there's a fabulous case to increase what's called the exemption on inheritance tax. So you increase it to 5 million, 10 million, whatever it might be, but you don't take the inheritance tax off the America's super rich, by the way, for which there are lots of economic data, largely didn't pay taxes along the way. And I don't mean illegally, but under the tax system. And so if you believe in a meritocracy, which is part of the Republican roots, because after all, Republicanism came from the Midwest. There are 3 towns, Jackson, Michigan, Ripon, Wisconsin, Crawfordsville, Iowa, that all had the earliest Republican meetings, and they were all anti-Whig. That is, they were very populist in the sense of they were meritocrats. They didn't like inherited wealth. And that part of the tradition apparently is going out the window, and that the combination of social values plus extreme tax cuts, and that is designed to hold the party together. In any regard, the sociological divisions are really rather large now in the Republican Party, as well as some of the philosophical divisions. But there are some things that have happened that you have to tip your hat to some people in this room that you might not identify with. That is, in a democracy, participation is a social good. And so the fact that 4 million fundamentalists volunteered on Election Day in 2004 is very impressive. And the only thing that one can say about that is that if one differs with the judgment, one should respect others that are participating and be equally motivated. But right now, the motivational aspect of American politics is a group that's religiously inspired and feels that they've been left out of the process of American politics. And that is a very interesting phenomenon. Then the question is how you respond. And the obvious fact is that people that have been left out, that have started to participate, don't want to participate with leaders that they don't affect. They don't want to elect and then step aside. They want to exert leadership. And that is what is happening within the party to some degree. In any regard, in a nutshell, the Republican Party activism has a trilogy of issues. And 2, everybody understand, pro-life, pro-tax cut. The third is really strange. In fact, it is bizarre to me, and it's called anti-UN. And that has lots of implications that relate more than to the UN. It involves multilateralism and all of the fields that people talk about at a school of this nature. But you see some very serious Republican candidates today making statements that are counterintuitive to judgment of anyone here at the Woodrow Wilson School of Princeton University. And I consider it terribly bizarre because, A, the judgment is bizarre, and B, it's a very few talking to themselves, but it just happens it affects national policy. For example, in the year 2000, I would guess, and I'm just guessing, that there might have been 100 to 200 neocons in the world. Maybe more, Mickey, I don't know. Maybe double that number. But our foreign policy of the United States came to be controlled by neocons, of whom there aren't any. And how that occurred is a sheer accident. In any regard, and I'm going to kind of conclude with this, because we've come under the grip in this country of a grim group of people who talk about realism. And if I were to ask all of you, do you consider yourself realist? Everyone would kind of say, yeah, Americans naturally consider themselves pragmatist or realist. But then, is there such a thing as pseudo-realism? And let me explain. Almost naturally, I don't know an American that doesn't want to say, yeah, I'd prefer to work in alliances. I like the idea of expanding international law. We have been governed by some pseudo-realists who suggest that it's virtuous to act alone in the world. That we, because we're a superpower, should not be bound by the same international laws that bind others. It is really an absolute aberration of American thought. And it is the most unrealistic set of statements that I know of in international affairs, and yet they're projected by people who have claimed the mantle of realists. And I just think people ought to think about this term, pseudo-realism. I'll just conclude with this. The question now is whether a political party that has been convulsed by a Southern strategy now has become a Southern political party, and I don't mean by that exclusively geographic, but by the case given to the South. And so the question is it going to become more balanced, and will there be a Northern strategy or a suburban strategy to match the Southern strategy, or are we going to see some third-party movements come along that are going to surprise everybody in their strength? And I think it'd be foolish to say that the Republican Party's viability is in doubt, but it isn't foolish at all to say that the philosophical base of the traditional Republican Party may have very little meaning with regard to what is the emerging Republican Party. Thank you.
Thank you. Juleanna.
Thank you. Thank you, Nolan. Thank you, Dale. Thank you, Mark, for pulling this together. I'm not a speech maker, so I will be brief. It's not something I do a lot. And plus, I'm very eager to hear what additional observations from the congressman. The congressman, as I know we all are. But sure, excuse me. Juleanna Glover. My background is, and I've worked from a range of Republicans, starting with Dan Quayle to Phyllis Schlafly, to John Ashcroft, to Steve Forbes. I was Cheney's press secretary through the first year of the administration, as well as his press secretary during the campaign in 2000. What strikes me as very interesting about this conversation is 15 years ago I worked for an organization called the Project for the Republican Future. It was a nonprofit founded by Bill Kristol with a lot of money from Rupert Murdoch and the entire sort of right-wing conspiracy. And they were hashing through these exact same questions. They were looking carefully at what the pro-life movement should look like, whether there's a way to bifurcate the language so that the pro-life Republicans who were pro-life but not sort of virulently so could get along with more moderate Republicans. And it struck me that what was interesting about that time, and what might have some parallels to what's happening now, is that back in 92 or 93, 94, this organization, small organization, headed by Kristol, got a tremendous amount of attention for doing one thing, and that was being in the forefront of attacking Bill Clinton's health care plan. And behind that, this very significant coalition of other Republicans, including lawmakers, including activists, suddenly realized that this disheartened entity of the Republican Party could indeed get some air under its wings by just going after what appeared to be fissures within the Clinton administration or fissures within the Democratic Party, because not everybody in the Democratic Party wanted to do Hillary care. I think now, as we're looking at going into a potential situation where you have Hillary Clinton as the nominee again, then these questions about what is the Republican Party, I don't know that, every party has very significant variances within the rank and file. But I think once you have an entity that you are uniformly opposed to, and I think Senator Clinton could easily take that form, the differences seem to disappear, and I feel that they will merge together quite a bit better. I don't know necessarily if that will happen if we have a pro-choice nominee on the Republican side, but if indeed the nominee is pro-life and pro-deficit reform, anti-wars of preemption perhaps, anti-torture, which I think a couple of people out there that are running might fulfill that bill. The question of what is the future of the Republican Party will no longer be important. You'll have an embodiment in the form of a single individual of who the party is, and that person will have the capacity, if they have a well-run campaign and a consistent message and some smart people, and there are still quite a number of very, very smart people in the Republican Party who do know how to win campaigns, running that operation, that I think that these the questions of what the platform looks like, I don't know that the platform will ever change. I know the platform is going to be written by the same people. I know Dave Gribbin and other individuals that have written it for decades and had the same fights every 4 years as to what the bits of language will look like. I think that those issues will play a lesser role to everyone except for perhaps the political reporters who seek to create stories, anything to write about on a day-to-day basis. But for the rank and file of the party, as well as most political observers, if we have a strong nominee, I think we have a strong party. And with that, I will return back to the conversation, because although I am not a good speech maker, I am a good bickerer.
That's good. That's good. Terrific. Okay, I think we'll open it up to questions, but I'll take the prerogative of asking the first question, following up on some points that both Jim and Juleanna made. Jim listed a list of possible definitions for what a party is. I would add to that, a party is a ballot line that candidates and factions and so forth compete over to get a nomination, and that's in some sense becomes the embodiment of the party, as Juleanna mentioned, which will happen once the Republicans have a candidate. So perhaps I'd like to just simply ask the panel, to what extent are the current state of distress and fissures that seems to be plaguing the Republican Party simply a function of it being in a historically unique position of not having an heir apparent, neither a president running for re-election or a vice president competing for office. It's not a majority party in either the House or the Senate, so it doesn't have a unified leadership there. How much of it really is just simply that this one additional embodiment of a party, a figurehead or the holder of a ballot line, responsible to the intensity of some of these intra-party squabbles?
Well, I'll start by saying I think not at all. And I think not at all because there's not that much difference between the Republican candidates. They're fighting among themselves to see who can say something louder or more often. But in terms of where they are philosophically, Giuliani may be the outlier. But John McCain certainly has been outspoken on questions about torture and so forth. But in terms of who can be more strongly for the war, or who can be more strongly appealing to the religious base. By the way, Karl Rove is wrong. That's not the base of the Republican Party. It's an activist group that has disproportionate influence because of the way they turn out and affect conventions. But I think what's going on is not a schism that is because people are now, there's no heir apparent, and so people are fighting to see who will rise up to become the next Republican standard bearer. I think that the problems are far, far deeper than that. During the Gingrich years, the Republicans sort of set aside principle and made as their primary goal to defeat Democrats at all costs, no matter what, and no matter what the issue. And they did that with wedge issues, and they did it with, nonstop campaigning and requiring people, asking people like myself and Jim, if we wanted a chairmanship or a leadership position, to put money into a common pool for the sole purpose of defeating other Democrats. I think that the party really at the moment doesn't really have a set of principles other than dominate the ballot. And to the extent that they do have a set of principles, it's not at all like what it used to be. It's not always the same people who write the platform, because if you do what I just did, which was to read carefully every Republican National Convention platform from 1964 to 2004, you would be absolutely stunned by how much the platform has changed and how little the 04 platform resembles the 64 platform on almost any major issue. And it's not just the party, it's the organizations that are associated with it. As I said, I was a founder of the Heritage Foundation. We had a statement of a mission statement, listed our values, when we were formed in 1973. It said nothing about traditional values. That was added 20 years later. So Republicans are kind of, and it's not just going back to Goldwater, it's going back to Reagan. A lot of people in the Republican Party like to quote Ronald Reagan's famous statement about that government's not the solution, government's the problem. What they fail to do is read the entirety of his statement. If you read the entire paragraph, he started in making that statement, and he was referring to the Carter administration of the government, and went on in the same paragraph to talk about we are not anti-government, we're for a government that stands with the people, and so forth. So, I think it's a party that has totally either forgotten what it believes, or doesn't care what it believes, so long as it can defeat the Democrats. So I think that's what the schism is over.
Well, first let me say, I'm really honored to be with Mickey. Mickey is probably the most decent conservative in the United States of America. He stands out a alone, I think he's the only one that's read all these platforms. And I don't know if a shrink came with that, Becky, but it might have been. Anyway, the strength of the Republican Party is the Democratic Party, and to a degree, and maybe a greater degree, vice versa. Now, part of it is the nature of modern times. There are thousands of issues that didn't exist before, and that's because we're in a more complicated world, and so it's inconceivable that you can identify with everything in one party or the other, that the parties can be totally consistent. But there is something about broad, basic philosophy that's gotten lost, but one of the symbols is that in one sense the Republicans have gotten a little like the Democrats, and that is they've started to go in interest groups. And historically, and maybe Barry Goldwater was the symbol of this, Barry was abstract philosophy. And today people go group targeted, but again, if you think about an academic center, how many times have you heard about anyone in politics talking about the common good? Or the British utilitarians used to talk about the greatest good of the greatest number. I mean, abstract notions like justice do not get expressed. And it's as if when people look at legislation from a congressional perspective, who's affected by what? And it's kind of a who-what game. I mean, Lenin used to talk about kto kavo, meaning who does what to whom. And that's a little bit the way American politics has become. And so one of the great questions is, can you bring some more abstractness, more principle back into the political parties? I'm afraid that Juleanna is absolutely right. If the Democrats produce a candidate that is a clear liability, that will serve to unite the Republican Party. On the other hand, they may not. And on the other hand, again, it could be a united party that does not attract the middle. And the dean objects to my one set of phrases I have. Over the last generation, we're about a third Democratic, a third Republican, a third no party. Today, the much bigger third is the Democrats, and the much smaller third is the Republican. And there's a public opinion poll out this week that says 25% of Republican women will vote for Hillary. And that's partly because she's run a pretty good campaign. Partly, in my mind, Republicans may well be misled by reliving 1994 in the sense that it just could be that Hillary Care is a very popular national notion. And Republicans are in a closet not to recognize that this country sees something wrong with the methodology of health care delivery, and that maybe there should be a role of government to try to even that out. And so when you ask, why do 25% of Republican women think about Hillary, I give the analogy, Mickey, and I'll end with this. When I first started out campaigning, I'd go to these farm bureau groups, and these clusters of male farmers would say, Jim, just remember, we're conservative, we want no more farm programs. Well, anyway, in a cluster nearby will be the wives, and I'll say, say, Mary, John just said she doesn't want any more farm programs, and she'll look up, oh, John, you don't mean that. Mary does the books. And I think this is the same thing when it comes to health care. Mary is kind of the one in charge of the family. And when the kids don't have health care, when she looks at the cost of health care, she's wondering, why don't we have national health care? And if the Republicans think they're going to win the presidency again on an anti-national health care agenda, I think they're not listening to the American public.
First,
Yes.
Mickey, well, briefly. I would say from 68 to 2004, yes, there has been a very significant change in what the platforms look like. But from 92 to 2004, I'm not sure, because I do, as we all have sort of participated in the conventions, and I'm obviously at a deficit here because I've really only been politically sentient since like 1989. So But from 1989 on, I've been very active at every convention and been in the rooms when lots of things happen. Sometimes as a very junior staffer, but women and elephants never forget. The same debates happen from 92 until 2004 as to what's important. Of course, what was changed in 2000 and 2004 was the role that Iraq played in foreign policy, and I would say that Iraq certainly was foreshadowed in the platform debates of 2000. I'd also like to talk about talk a little bit about sort of women in politics, and I'd like to see the cross references for the 25% of Republican women who would say that they would support Hillary. I would say that those 25% are probably pro-choice. That's a pretty good Rubicon to cross if you're a pro-life woman. Supporting Hillary Clinton would be something that would be a difficult thing to do. With regard to health care, and again, I'm good at bickering, and pretty much that's it, grabbing onto little things. Most Americans are completely satisfied with their current health plan. And the idea of radically changing it is a scary thing. Sort of proposals that are put before Congress that offer significant change, those might, when they appear as this fabulous apparition at first glance, with the devil's in the details, and I would say that the political ad makers know how to inflate that devil and make it as terrifying as possible. And that in mind, I think that if we go into a situation where we have a not particularly effective or a not particularly fortifying or if we don't have a scary Democratic nominee, the Republican Party is very much in trouble, especially if we have a pro-choice, if we have a not scary nominee on the Democratic side and a pro-choice nominee on the Republican side. I think the Republican Party is going to be in a world of trouble because there will be no galvanizing force to get people to the polls. And unless we have an incident where you have 20 American soldiers taken hostage by Iran and they're not released, I don't know what's going to stir people to support in droves the Republican Party. I do think that it's going to take a situation of extremes, politicians of extremes, hopefully a Republican politician that has, solidly held conservative beliefs, which of course to some people on the liberal side of the spectrum is someone of extreme beliefs. I think on either. If you have a pro-life candidate on the Republican side, they would of course be someone who would be terrifying to many people on the liberal side of the spectrum. I think much of the party right now is so distorted. Our views are so distorted by 9/11 and the after effects that many of us don't even recognize what a deficit hawk looks like. And I think that it carefully highlighted, a deficit hawk carefully highlighted with strong conservative underpinnings could very well go on and win a national election and be president. However, if they're running against somebody like, an Edwards that can be less scary, we'll see.
Perfect. I think we can open it up to audience questions now. Yes.
Would you be able to comment on what I call the no way Jose strategy, meaning the immigration issue as the Republicans are approaching it, and whether or not the defeat of J.D. Hayward, for instance, in Arizona, the success of Jeff Flake in Arizona, doesn't say something really scary about Republican prospects in the future? Or not?
Let me just say one quick thing. Usually that kind of appeal, as irrational as it is to many Americans, is more effective in a shorter time period than in a longer time period because Jose will vote sometime. And so at some time there are going to be far greater numbers of current immigrants voting. And so you might say an irrational appeal might be more effective today than tomorrow. And then the question becomes, how long away is tomorrow? But many have tried to assess when people are going to be voting and what kinds of numbers. But certainly there are some, to more than a few Americans, this is an absolute single issue in one direction, and then it's an absolute single issue on the other flip side as well. I mean, so you've got an analogy to pro-life, pro-choice, but you never know exactly at a point in time where the percentages work out. And they can be different in different parts of the country. But I like to think of it not in terms of numbers, but in terms of what's right and wrong. And if you think of it in terms of right and wrong, you come to a different set of conclusions.
Well, I would just say that Republicans have not handled their message on this very well. You can rationally draw a distinction between immigration and be pro-immigration and not be in favor of rewarding illegal immigration. That is a rational position. What happens, though, is that people who rightly did not want to reward people who broke the law and came in illegally then fell behind the idea, so round them all up and ship them home, which is not a very rational idea given the numbers and the cost and everything that's involved in that. And so probably the right answer, I can't remember the last time I said anything positive about our current president, even though he's my party, but you know, maybe his answer, which was to recognize that they came in illegally and to make them pay some penalty for having done so, but also try to create some path by which they can become legal citizens, you know, may have been the right way to go about it, and the Republican Party did not do a very good job of embracing what I thought was a pretty rational way to deal with the problem, which exists. And you can't go back and say it doesn't exist. It's here. So we just handled it badly.
Yeah. I would just quickly add that this is a really tough issue for the Republican Party, because unlike abortion, where you have the most pro-life people and people who are somewhat pro-choice in the Republican Party, the Republican Party has the most anti-immigration people and the most pro-immigration people, and so it's a really an issue that's not even as easily to reconcile as maybe even abortion is within the party.
And the level of stupidity is so high because George Bush got like 40% of the Hispanic vote. You know, I mean, this was you know, it's kind of like saying, well, you know, we appreciated it last time, we don't want you, you know, anymore. I mean, it was really not done very brightly.
Yeah, I'm completely befuddled as to how Republicans oppose immigration reform. To me, it is just an astoundingly idiotic position to oppose it. And I would also go on to argue that almost any congressman or senator who is in the forefront of opposing this immigration reform probably didn't even know how to use his own email. So these are, I don't get it. It's such a self-defeating position to take.
Yeah, but don't say that they're all like JD. I mean, that's, I hope not.
Yes. There are no top 10 greatest in Democratic Party. And even the organization, his cousins will vote.
Yeah.
The Hispanic ones was one place.
It's also just the right thing to do. I mean, it's just...
and one little historical point, the UN point, Jim, I mean, I think that was always a recessive party for the Republican Party. I mean, go back and read conservative or Phyllis Schlafly.
Trilateral Commission, bad words.
This is not a good word to use. So that was a recessive party. It's coming now.
Well, with one exception. I mean, George Bush the First got more support from the UN than he got from the United States Senate. In the first Gulf War, Dwight David Eisenhower never came close to losing UN vote. This administration, for the first time in the history of the United States, on 10 votes, we didn't have a single supporter in the United Nations in the General Assembly. I mean, we become that isolated.
I agree. I think it's a recessive gene that became a dominant gene.
No, well, possibly, but there's an ambivalence in American history between very active internationalism and kind of an isolationism. And it is true in the Republican Party in the West, you always had a little bit of an isolationist gene. And for example, Jeanette Rankin, our first woman member of Congress, who was elected in 1916 to vote against World War I, was elected in 1940 because of isolationism, not pacifism. And that is kind of a Western gene too. And here the Republican Party has put that gene aside, the isolationist gene.
But the question I had, though, was really about the Republican I find most interesting today on the national system is actually Newt Gingrich, the man who introduced all of that slash and burn agenda. Recently, he was talking about Hillary's health care. It was very interesting. He's against it. But he's against it in very measured ways. He said, she's asking me the right questions. We have different solutions to these problems. Come, let us reason together.
Every once in a while, he has lucid moments.
Well, I wonder if that's lucidity that could be the best solution for the problem.
Not if it's associated with Newt.
Yeah.
You talk about Newt. Sean, let me tell you, Newt will say what you want him to say, and he will walk in carrying an armload of books under his arm, and state the obvious, and do it in such a way that you'll say, "Wow, he's smart."
State the obvious in this case, and that backing off from what had been and what has led to kind of polarization, ideological domination of both parties, especially.
Sean, just so you know, you're right in your premise. He is the most interesting Republican in the country. Whether Mickey or I might support him for president is a different thing. But I will tell you something. People change, and I will give you my view of Newt. There's a partial lobotomy here. That right now, he is the Hubert Humphrey of American politics. He is a happy warrior. In the old days when Mickey and I dealt with him, there was kind of a gruffness to him. He is now uplifting, smart, interesting, and he can't stop talking ideas. And he is the most interesting Republican. Whether that's a presidential set of traits the public will have to think about, but it's very intriguing.
And the reason I was intrigued by it, especially, is because it was willingness to engage. In other words, it wasn't simply that he was, saying his own ideas.
That's right.
That's always yes. But he was willing to say, we disagree about means, but the ends are the same. And that strikes me as a move away from actually.
You bet.
That's important. And the point is, maybe it's better. I say this as a person who's never taken the Republican Party. It's not the top of my list. But if the Republicans lose this time around, then that seat of reason might be there. So that both parties, the Democrats have their problems too, both parties might be looking at the 21st century instead of trying to destroy each other. And that might be a good thing.
That would be nice.
Yes.
I wonder if all of you could comment on, given the dire strait of the Republican Party kind of painting, and the obvious fact they did lose Congress in 2006, how do you explain the fact that Rudolph Giuliani is running dead heat with the ex-First Lady?
So's McCain.
Does this seem impossible, or does it have something to do with things like, maybe some of you are familiar with the book, Whatever Happened to Kansas? Representative Leach, your next-door neighbor. Maybe a lot of swing voters don't necessarily outside the South and the conservative wing love the Republican Party. Maybe they might have some animosity against the Democratic Party, what it stands for, its candidates. So maybe since 1994, maybe that's why the Republicans are getting elected. Is there any validity to any of this?
Let me just tell you one quick anecdote. One day, a couple of years ago, we had...
I'm sorry?
one day, a couple of years ago, we had what was called a mandatory caucus. I don't often go to our Republican caucuses, but this was so-called mandatory. I walked in and they had some pollster telling us what was happening in the public's mind. And anyway, this pollster went down every single issue, and it was just all horrifying news for the Republicans, although it's more horrifying today. And so someone timidly raised their hands and said to this pollster, "Is there any good news?" And the pollster said yes, that they're now into this new type of polling where they measure the public pulse when people speak. You know, Mickey says something, they go like this. He says something else, they go down. And some. Well, anyway, they took Meet the Press for a few weeks. They measured the public pulse, and every time a particularly prominent female leader of the Democratic Party was on, and every time a particularly prominent New York senator was on, support for Republicanism went up. That was the only good news. And so there is the point that Republicans do have some benefit from the opposition. But you can't count on that. I mean, one of the things we don't know is candidates that may look weak at one point in time can take on new auras. I mean, John F. Kennedy was not an immensely strong senator. He wasn't even an immensely strong candidate, but he became quite a strong president in the public eye. And it's conceivable that one of the big three in the Democratic side could emerge to be quite strong and quite attractive if nominated. And vice versa on the Republican side.
Could someone else comment on that? Why is it a dead heat?
It's also a dead heat when it's Hillary versus McCain. I mean, I think that she's very polarizing, and if she is indeed the nominee, whoever the Republican nominee is, it's going to be a fight, as Cheney likes to say, 3 yards in a cloud of dust. I mean, there's going to be 3 to 4 percentage points of the vote that Republicans and Democrats are going to be scrapping over, and, I don't know that Hillary Clinton has the capacity to win those 3 to 4, but I do know that a Republican nominee, a strong Republican nominee, i.e. someone like a McCain, has every capacity to do that. So, the dead heat issue right now, any Republican with national name ID is going to poll equally to Hillary Clinton, and it's going to be within 4 to 5 points is what this whole fight is going to be about.
But you need to consider all the variables. It's not just problems with Hillary or whatever. Karl Rove really doesn't understand the Republican Party. He doesn't understand the Republican base. He thinks it is all this little group that they turn out to nominate, those who they can get to the polls because they're more energized. Giuliani, in fact, speaks to the Republican Party. And he is much more in line with what the typical Republican voter in the country thinks, than people would have thought.
Yes, right here.
One of the explanations for Giuliani's successful polling is the fact that there are 32 million voters of Italian descent in this country. Very quietly, with less publicity than went on with Kennedy, these Italians who tended to this pretty much even Republican and Democrats are swinging massively to Giuliani, which is a major chunk of the vote, and it is something which is simply not, indeed, in these days, multiculturalism, etc., even talked about as the Italians as a voting bloc. And Giuliani is benefited by that massively.
Yes, in the back here. That's almost equivalent to him.
I had a question, mostly for Representative Leach, but maybe for the others as well. You talked about the 3 major dichotomies within the Republican Party: anti-tax versus fiscal conservatism budget, values versus maybe I guess you could call it libertarian. And then you named a third division, namely the anti-UN people. And I noticed that was the only issue where you didn't name an alternate group. I mean, I certainly know that there are a lot of people in this country who don't want to chop off the UN and send it over the ocean or anything like that. But at the same time, do you see anything other than anti-UN? I mean, is there a coherent doctrine in the Republican Party that can actually be an alternative to that, other than simply taking pot shots at the ludicrousness of the established position?
Well, first let me come back to what I said. I mentioned the UN slightly later. The contrast I made was between restrained non-interventionism versus more active use of military force. That was the contrast. But coming to your question of anti-UN, which means much more than just the United Nations. I think it is very impressive how in public opinion polling, the UN, from its inception, has always had overwhelming public support. It has never been below 70%, and often it's in the 90s. Now we're at one of the lower ebbs. But the point I'm getting at is this anti-internationalism, I think, is a very thin reed, and it's becoming a thinner reed in the American public mind, with the exception on the economic side, because there's a globalism dimension to it, that anti-globalism is a feeling in every country in the world, and the vast majority of people in the world think their country is disadvantaged by globalism. And despite the fact that world or GDP growth has been up about 5% the last few years, most countries feel disadvantaged by it. And then some people in all societies are disadvantaged, so it isn't just that they think it, they literally are. Others are benefited. But those that are disadvantaged, it symbolizes that life is beyond the control of the individual and the family, and it's part of this modern world where up till 3 or 4 generations ago, 99% of the people that ever lived did just exactly what their mother and father did, and there was no choice in job, no alternative. Today, and there's only one job in life. Today, people are having lots of jobs. There's a discombobulation to that is everybody understands, and I think that is part of this feeling. But I think, as far as the UN itself, a candidate can realistically step forward and say some quite positive things and be well received.
We've had previous times when the UN was not held in the highest regard by a Republican administration. When Jeane Kirkpatrick was the U.S. ambassador to the UN, she used a measuring stick saying that American aid to various countries should be predicated on the degree to which they supported American policies in the UN. So those things have happened. But what's happened in the foreign policy arena is a few things. One was when the neocons came in, most of whom had been active on the left, and Sean and I have actually talked about this. Jeane Kirkpatrick was a member of the Young Socialist League, and others though were. They were people who were pro-democracy, but they were also very much in favor of activist government, and so forth. And so they were not part of the original Republican conservative base, and they came in and they wanted to promote democracy. Well, that's a great idea. And who doesn't want to promote democracy around the world? But as they've gone on, they have become very impatient with the idea of using the soft power methods that are available to help promote democracy, and more willing to, one of the old Republican traditions was prudence. Always act prudently. Prudence has kind of gone out the window. We want democracy. Democracy is good. If you have democracy in the Middle East or anywhere else, it's good, so let's make it happen. And as a part of that, we've gone from an emphasis, first of all, that you fight if you're attacked, to you fight preemptively, which you can, I think, certainly defend. The idea that, if somebody's about to hit you, you hit them first before they can hit you, to now we've gone from preemptive to preventive. Well, there's a possibility that they're going to get the weapons at some point down the line where it could be a threat to us. Let's take them out. And there is among the people, by the way, the neocons have virtually no influence in the Republican Party at the grassroots, at the convention level. But they have a lot. at the upper levels in the administrations, and seem to have abandoned any sense of restraint in terms of pursuing what they think will create, their sense of an ideal world, and I think that's scary too.
Yes, here.
Yes, I'd like to ask, there are people in this room sitting on that side who study this a lot more than I do, but it looks like a pretty decent year for Democrats in the United States. Not any study involved there. It could potentially be a very big one for Democrats. Operating under that assumption, if you could just do that assumption if you'd like to, I'm wondering whether you think the fragments within the Republican Party will be, whether you close ranks or whether people will split apart. Basically, whether the coalition will respond well to the defeat and sort of reassess their values and move forward, or whether they'll split apart and do a while before we see a coalition form.
During the period when I was active, Republicans were quite used to defeat. It was victory that we had a hard time with, and as we showed, when we took control of Congress, and except for an occasional Jim Leach, we screwed it up pretty badly. I think that there will be a lot of reflection if Republicans lose again, trying to figure out where to place the blame. A lot of it will properly fall on George Bush. A lot of it will properly fall on the way Republicans administered the Congress. But I think that there are forces within the party that are very strong, within the party organizations, that are going to prevent it from actually changing too dramatically. I was once driving through France. I was driving around this mountain road where it was one of these things where you could not really go around the curve without going over the center line. And so there were gendarmes waiting there, of course, and to give me a ticket, but I don't speak French. And so that, they were trying to tell me, that I was being fined. And since I didn't speak French, they kept shouting it louder and louder, hoping that if they said it loudly enough, I would get it. And I think that's what Republicans are more likely to do. I think they're more likely to fall back on exactly what they have been saying, kind of cursing the American people for not being smart enough to see the wisdom of what they were saying, and just try to figure out a way to say the same thing more effectively.
No, please do. I'll let you.
I think it's difficult to predict because you don't know who the candidates and how the election unfolds, but let me explain what I mean. If Juleanna is the candidate and he loses, you'll have a very powerful right, I told you so. If you have someone maybe at the right, the moderates might say, we told you so. And so you get two different kind of reactions. And then there's something happening this year that is in the wings, and we don't know its meaning yet, and that is there's going to be a third-party movement at least, and there may be a fourth-party movement. There may be two third-party movements, that is, two in the middle. And what roles those play will also have something to do. If you, for example, have Mayor Bloomberg on a third-party ticket, what does that mean? Who does he draw from? What lessons do you get from that? If you have Sam Nunn, what lessons do you draw? Or a Bill Bradley? You don't know yet, and there are things to come. And then it could be that we're going to have an arch-conservative ticket. Let's say a Pat Robertson. Under some scenarios, and it may be Tom Tancredo, and what that role would play. Or, some in the Christian right are suggesting if so-and-so is nominated, we're going to have our candidate. Now, my own personal view is that the only likely candidate in the Republican Party today, and I put it way up into at least a 75% likelihood, is that Huckabee is going to be on the ticket. And probably is deep, but conceivably he's the nominee. That makes it he becomes a consensus deep choice for Giuliani or Mitt Romney if they're at the top. And so that will have some effect. And then we don't know the chemistry about, this could well be a brokered convention, which would be a very interesting phenomenon. Again, nobody knows. And how that will work out and how people's feelings will be. And you go into something like that, and one group might say, if we don't get exactly who we want, we will never back this ticket. And so I think these things could be interesting. They also could very likely be quite muscular. And so there are too many things that are imponderable. But I personally think there is a possibility, and I don't put this at 50-50 or maybe even at 1 and 4, but not an insignificant possibility that there'll be a central third-party ticket that will not only exist in this election, but be a factor in future elections. How that relates to the two parties, we're not sure. Right now, the Democrats, insiders, are particularly paranoid about this because they see, as you premised, that this looks like a good Democratic year. And so you put Bloomberg up there, who does he draw from? You put some other candidates up there, who do they draw from? And it could be they draw more from Democrats than Republicans, and we forget a third party of trivial significance elected George Bush in 2000. That is, if we did not have Ralph Nader on the ticket in Florida, Al Gore would have been elected President of the United States. As trivial a number of votes as Nader got. And so you get a ticket that might get a percentage or two, or maybe a dozen, or maybe more than that. How that works into this, and then how that works into the blamesmanship that will go on in both parties afterwards, it's really premature to assess. One of the factors I'm sure will be people are going to not like the way this primary season worked. I mean, the fact is they're coming too quickly and they're too bunched. And people are going to want to try to come up with a more orderly process. And, for example, if both parties have decided by February, and if, as Juleanna suggests, maybe it's Hillary and maybe you have a controversial Republican choice, does that propel really active third and fourth party movements? I don't know.
Let me jump in real quick. And first of all, it does indeed look right now like the Democrats could have a very good year in 2008. But, if we look back at history, fall in 91, it looked like it would be very unlikely for George Bush Sr. to lose the election. It didn't become sort of we didn't know that he was a flawed candidate until going into later into the year, and then leading into the primaries when Buchanan did so well. That in mind, though, there's other variables that will come into play. There's economic variables that could be very important as we go into next year. The Fed is likely to continue dropping rates. You could be in a situation where the economy is going beautifully in August or September of next year, and the economy is growing, people have jobs. The immigration debate isn't so important when jobs are more plentiful and available and people feel as though they can go out and buy a house at a decent price and also sell their house at a decent price. There could be just a radically different perception on the part of the American people as to where the country's going. Iraq could calm down, or alternatively, Iran could become much more of a problem. And, let's say the Israelis don't step up and do something about Iran, and America has to do something about Iran. Or there's a direct threat. A direct threat from the Iranians on Americans. I think all of that will crystallize how people and how voters view both Republicans and Democrats. And I'd argue that they would in that type of scenario, a Republican candidate will be more appealing than a Democrat candidate.
We're going to run out of time soon. So what I'd like to do, I know several people have raised their hands. I'd like to get several questions out into the open and give the commentators one last shot at trying to tie some of those questions together. So why don't you start, and there's several others who want to get in.
Thank you. Outside the outside fringes of the issue, the abortion matter has been decided by Roe v. Wade. Now, it could be overturned a la Dred Scott by a future Supreme Court or a constitutional amendment to change it. But yet, it's way up at the top of the list. It's been mentioned today at least a couple dozen times. And in the public's eye, as many times as it's obscured things like fiscal policy, foreign policy, and things that are infinitely more important. Do you think that the temperature will ever be turned down so that is less of an issue than it is today? It's been mentioned so many times today that That's almost the first thing that anybody asks about a candidate, and it's probably the one they have the least impact on.
Terrific. Let's get some more questions on here. Yes.
There seems to be consensus that the Republicans do well as far as, in contrast to the Democrats. Congressman Leach, you said, one of the strengths of the Republican Party is the Democratic Party. And, it's sort of mentioned offhand, is there anything inherently wrong with our party being defined by who we're opposed to? The party was founded on being opposed to slavery, so why is there anything bad about saying that we're opposed to, all its elements of the Democrats' agenda?
My question was just about the Clintons. Cutting my teeth politically, growing up with Bill Clinton in power, I often wonder why we can never effectively attack them or frame them in the correct way that they should be framed. They have enough baggage for 5 lifetimes, as we all know. And I just didn't know if anybody has any ideas why we continue to fail, put them in proper context, and what we can do in the future if Hillary is the nominee, and how we can effectively make the American people finally see what they really are.
Okay, so why don't we'll answer any of those 3 or all 3 or?
Well, first of all, Nolan, I become a little nervous about saying this with you and Larry and and Sean and all the academic experts in here, but there has been a tendency, which I think is perhaps being lessened a little bit, about looking at politics through a rational choice model, as though people who engage in politics and people who cast their votes act in a rational manner. And in fact, I don't think voters are irrational, but they're non-rational. They act not by careful balancing and measuring, but they react in terms of their aspirations and their fears, and I react a lot in terms of the things that they're opposed to, that they would like to prevent. And so I think whether it's abortion or a party defining itself to some extent as the non-other party, or the anti-war and the party that is taking to war. I think that's just going to happen because voters logically, who want to shape what kind of society they live in, look at it in the negative as well as a positive sense. So what kind of society they want to live in, what kind of society they want to not live in, and I think that's simply going to happen. But when that happens, I think it's important to do that in terms of principle. Hopefully a consistent principle. At one time with the Republicans, that consistent principle was the Madisonian concept of the Constitution. But I would hate to see it become so personalized, for example, that it was sufficient, that somebody named Clinton were on the other side. I think that you can't really, Republicans ought not to define themselves as the anti-Clinton. Democrats ought not to identify themselves as the anti-W. Bush, but stand, hopefully, for a set of coherent, consistent principles that I would hope would be anchored in the Constitution and what it permits, what it requires, and what it prohibits. I don't know whether either party is going to get to that point, but I hope I would someday see it.
Well, let me begin with Roe versus Wade. My favorite anecdote in this is there was a poll 15 years ago in Iowa that said that about 10% of Iowans, if given a choice, would only vote pro-life. And about 10% of Iowans, if given a choice, would only vote pro-choice. But 60% said they didn't want to vote for the candidate who raised the issue. And I thought that was a very interesting phenomenon. Now, what has amazed me, because there has been some simmering of this issue, is the manner in which it's extended to other issues and that are related, but not necessarily logically. And the most profound at the moment is stem cells. And it has always struck me that a very credible pro-life person could also be pro-stem cell. pro-embryonic stem cell, that is. But it still remains a trigger issue, and so Congress has had a very hard time grappling with it because the activist groups don't hold it that way. But to me, that's of grave interest. As far as the Clintons, I mean, it is true they have some baggage. It's also true some of those bags are quite attractive. And for example, Bill Clinton has been a marvelous ex-president on the international AIDS issue. And there's no other definition about it. In fact, all of us as Americans should be proud that Bill Clinton has produced a positive image of the United States of America in much of sub-Saharan Africa. And that's good for America, not good for Bill Clinton, I mean, particularly, because most American citizens don't know it. But it's good for America. There are some negative sides of the Clintons that a lot of people know something about too. But I think, you want to be balanced in this. And then that comes into the against question, because there are reasons to have either intellectual reasons or kind of chemistry reasons that you don't identify with someone else. I'm a Midwesterner. It strikes me we ought to have a Midwestern leadership. But, I frankly am very appalled by two tall leaders. But that's just a personal thing. I mean, so we all, have something, that we were awkward about, but that's just the way life is.
I think the pro-life issue is going to be a huge, or pro-choice issue is going to be a huge issue going into this election, primarily because I guess there's a consensus opinion that there'll be 3 Supreme Court judgeships likely to be filled by the next president. I think I think that is something that's more clearly understood by the populace, particularly Republican primary voters in Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina. I think that'll probably be the death knell for Giuliani. I don't think that the Republican Party will nominate someone who's questionable on those issues because of the fact that there could be some significant changes in the court for the next presidency. With regard to how we work as an opposition party and how we are opposed, actually, I would think that the Republicans are probably better at fighting against ideas than coming up with their own sometimes, because we are so divided amongst ourselves. But the exact same thing can be said about the Democrats. It's a universal political trait. We're really good at tearing things down. And then the Clintons, I feel as though we probably have thrown everything but the kitchen sink at them already, and I don't know it will necessarily stick to Hillary Clinton if she is indeed the nominee, but, all those charges will be brought up again. All of the stuff will be thrown at her by a bunch of different C-boards that are going to spend millions, and whether it works or not, I have no idea. But, theoretically, she's not a perfect candidate. She does make mistakes on occasion, and, with any luck, they'll be well-timed, and she'll do it in front of a camera. So. Oh, better yet, her husband will. Probably not in front of a camera, though.
Wait a minute. I'd like to thank again the panelists, and thank you all for coming out this afternoon.